Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the podcast where we take sources, dig into them, and pull out the key knowledge so you don't have to wade through it all.
Yeah, giving you that shortcut to being genuinely informed.
And today we're tackling a really fascinating source. It's excerpts from a book called The Western Intellectual Tradition, from Leonardo to Hegel. We're focusing on the stretch from the Renaissance up to what the book calls the Age of Reasoned Dissent.
Right. And the cool thing about this source, this book, is how it views history. It's not just about ideas floating in space.
No.
It argues that intellectual history is totally tangled up with, actual events, inventions, technical stuff, social stuff, and just the energy of people doing things. It uses history as a way to see things more clearly, like an instrument of vision for today.
Exactly. So our goal here is to walk through these periods the source highlights as major turning points in Western thought. We'll look at the big names, the key movements, and maybe see how these shifts from way back then can shed some light on what we're dealing with now.
We're starting with the period the book labels the expanding world, which is roughly 1500 to 1630.
Okay.
And then we'll move into the Age of Reasoned Dissent. That's about 1630 to 1760. These aren't just arbitrary dates. They represent really fundamental changes in thinking.
Okay, let's dive in then. The expanding world. First up, the Renaissance. Now, the source mentions right away that dating the Renaissance is, well, tricky.
Historians argue about it. Some push it way back to the 12th or 13th century, connecting it to earlier revivals.
Right, while others point to things like the fall of Constantinople in the mid-15th century, or maybe the invention of printing. Big, dramatic events.
But the key takeaway isn't the exact date, It's seeing the Renaissance as this really complex pivot point. The source stresses it wasn't just looking back at classical stuff, though that was part of it.
What else, then?
Well, it marks the emergence of, let's call it modern man, this growing individualism, a new belief in human ability, in reason, and, crucially, the beginnings of empirical science.
The idea you learn by observing, by experimenting, not just from old texts.
Exactly, a huge shift.
And the book points to Leonardo da Vinci as someone who just perfectly captures that transition, right?
Oh, absolutely. He wasn't just an artist. Painter, sculptor, architect, musician, scientist, inventor, anatomist. The list goes on.
A true Renaissance man.
Totally. And the source focuses on his notebooks, thousands of pages. It's not abstract theory. It's filled with detailed observations, sketches, ideas based on what he saw.
Like his anatomy work.
Yes. He wasn't just reading Galen. He was dissecting human bodies, drawing muscles, bones, trying to figure out the mechanics, how things actually worked.
And his flying machines?
Same thing. Observing birds, studying air currents, designing based on empirical understanding of movement and mechanics. He embodies that mix of art and science, this kind of restless, self-taught mind moving towards a very practical, hands-on way of knowing.
And where was all this energy centered? The source says it wasn't the old medieval power centers.
No, it was the Italian city-states. Places like Milan, Florence, Rome, Venice. They were hubs of trade, banking, enormous wealth.
Driven by merchants and bankers, not feudal lords.
Right. And that money funded the art, obviously, but it also created a whole new political game. These cities were constantly competing, making alliances, fighting.
Diplomacy and strategy.
Exactly. The source talks about the rise of the art of statesmanship. Politics became less about, divine right and old customs, and more about secular power, strategy, reading situations.
And wealth itself became a status symbol. Showing off your riches.
Yeah, the rise of luxury, reflecting that merchant class power.
Okay, so this new political climate leads us straight to Machiavelli. Probably the most famous name from that scene, maybe infamous.
Definitely infamous for some. The Prince is the key text here.
And what made it so shocking, so different?
Well, it was his whole approach. He wasn't writing a guidebook on how to be a good prince based on Christian morals or whatever, no. He looked at how rulers actually got power and, more importantly, how they kept it in the real world. His method was almost empirical for politics. Look at the facts, look at history, look at human nature as it is.
So separating politics from morality.
Pretty much. For Machiavelli, the state was its own thing, with its own needs. Survival, stability, that's the goal. He analyzed political actions like a science or an art. What works, what doesn't, regardless of whether it's nice.
It's a very modern, kind of cold-eyed view of power.
Absolutely. And as a total contrast, the source brings in Thomas More.
Utopia.
Right. If Machiavelli showed the world as it is, More imagined it as it could be, based on very different principles, Christian humanism.
Utopia is this ideal society. Right?
Yeah.
communal living, justice.
Yeah, it's a direct critique of the problems More saw in England at the time. The source mentions the enclosure movement landlords fencing off common land, pushing peasants out, causing poverty. Utopia was the opposite of all that.
A response to real social ills.
Definitely. But More's own life ended tragically, didn't it?
Yeah, executed by Henry VIII.
It highlights that growing tension, that clash between individual conscience or religious belief and the power of the state. More wouldn't accept Henry's break from the Catholic Church, a political move by the king, and paid the ultimate price.
A sign of things to come, really.
For sure. And More was part of that broader humanist movement the source discusses. Figures like Erasmus, too.
What was humanism all about, fundamentally?
Well, it put a huge value on human potential, on education, especially in classical literature, rhetoric, and often a belief in tolerance, reasoned argument. Erasmus was kind of the poster child for that.
But these humanists, like More and Erasmus, they got caught in the middle of something huge, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. The Reformation. Just looming, then exploding.
Martin Luther, 1517.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a theological debate, the source emphasizes.
Not at all. It had massive religious, political, and economic fallout. Luther questioning things like indulgences, focusing on individual faith, scripture over church authority.
His 95 Theses.
Right. It just lit a fire under all the existing discontent. And Europe basically split apart.
Leading to religious wars.
Terrible ones, like the 30 Years' War. Just devastating. But beyond the violence, it fundamentally changed the church-state relationship.
How so?
Well, rulers started picking sides. Protestant princes aligned with Luther or Calvin. This often meant the state took control of the church within its borders. Religion became subordinate to political power in many places.
State churches.
Exactly. The source also brings up John Calvin in Geneva, creating this very disciplined, almost theocratic society.
But the book also hints at a connection between Calvinism and later economic ideas.
Yeah, it's something later thinkers explored, whether the Calvinist emphasis on hard work, thrift, a calling, might have unintentionally paved the way for certain aspects of economic individualism or capitalism. It shows how religious ideas can ripple outwards in unexpected ways.
Okay, so politics and religion are in turmoil. But something else is stirring too, the scientific revolution.
Another fundamental shift, this one in how people understood the actual physical world.
Moving away from the old Greek models, Aristotle, Ptolemy.
Right. For centuries, that was the framework. Earth-centered universe, physics based on qualities, not math. Copernicus kicked things off by suggesting maybe the sun was the center, a huge theoretical leap.
But the source highlights Galileo as being key for the method.
Definitely. Galileo wasn't just thinking, he was looking. Using the telescope, which was pretty new, to observe the moon's craters, Jupiter's moons, sunspots.
Stuff that didn't fit the old model.
Exactly. Empirical proof. And he did experiments, like with falling objects, trying to describe motion with mathematics. Measurement became key.
But this new science clashed with the established powers, didn't it?
Hugely. Both religious and philosophical authorities were invested in the old worldview. Galileo's trial is the classic example. This new way of knowing observation, experiment, math was seen as a threat.
So by the late 1500s, early 1600s, the source says the intellectual hotspot starts moving north, away from Italy.
Yeah, particularly to England, the Elizabethan Age and beyond.
Figures like Sir Walter Raleigh.
Right, explorer, courtier. And the source mentions Thomas Harriot, who was connected to Raleigh's circle, sometimes called the School of Night.
What was Harriot known for?
He was a brilliant mathematician, astronomer, scientist. They were discussing all the new ideas, the cutting-edge stuff. It shows England becoming this major center, not just for exploration and power, but for intellectual life, too.
Okay, so that's the expanding world. Individualism, political realism, religious fragmentation, a whole new way of looking at the universe through science. Quite a setup.
Absolutely. Which leads us directly into the next phase the source identifies.
Yeah.
The Age of Reasoned Dissent, roughly 1630 to 1760.
Reasoned dissent. So challenging authority, but with arguments.
That's the idea. And the main stage for this, according to the source, is England again, with the Puritan Revolution.
The English Civil War.
Right. Massive conflict. It stemmed from this deep tension between the Crown King Charles believing in his divine right to rule absolutely.
And Parliament. Pushing for more power, more say in governing.
Exactly. It boiled over into war, the execution of the king, which was unprecedented, really.
And figures like Oliver Cromwell emerge.
Yes. Now, the source is clear. The Puritans weren't exactly aiming for modern democracy as we know it. Their vision was complex, deeply religious.
But it had lasting impacts.
Oh, huge ones. The source argues this period really forged ideas that are foundational for us. Things like religious liberty, the idea you shouldn't be forced into the state religion.
The concept of a limited state, that the ruler's power isn't absolute.
Precisely. And it also boosted this spirit of economic individualism. So while it was chaotic, it hammered out these concepts of rights, limits on power, individual conscience versus the state.
Ideas that carried forward.
Definitely. And then, after all that upheaval, the monarchy gets restored, but something new emerges from the scientific side of things.
The Royal Society, founded in 1660.
Yes. This was a big deal. It gave science an institution, a formal place for people to meet, share findings, conduct experiments. It even got royal backing from Charles II.
And their motto says it all, right?
Well,
Nullius in verba.
on the word of no one. Perfect summary of the empirical spirit. Don't just trust what Aristotle said or anyone else. Verify it. Observe it. Test it.
And they were doing real science there, not just talking.
Absolutely. The source mentions examples. You had Christian Huygens improving clocks vital for navigation and astronomy.
Practical stuff.
Very. And Cassini and Roemer using astronomical observations probably discussed at the Society to make the first real estimates of the speed of light. Think about that, measuring the speed of light in the 1600s.
Incredible.
And people like William Petty doing groundbreaking work in anatomy, medicine, but also applying systematic methods to social issues, early economics, statistics, trying to understand society almost scientifically.
So the Royal Society really cemented England as a scientific powerhouse, building on what started earlier.
Yeah, it took that empirical method and gave it a home structure, promoting collaboration and evidence-based knowledge.
So looking back at this whole sweep, Renaissance, Reformation, Scientific Revolution, Puritan Revolution, the Royal Society, the source paints these as genuine turning points.
Absolutely. Fundamental shifts in how people saw everything. Themselves, society, God, the universe, authority, how you even know something is true.
And the book's main idea that these old problems are still living problems really comes through.
It really does. Think about Machiavelli's realism about power.
Still relevant.
Totally. Understanding how power works separate from how we wish it worked, that's basic to international relations, politics, even business strategy today. You have to deal with the reality of it.
Or the legacy of that reasoned dissent in England, the limited state, individual liberty.
Foundational for liberal democracy, right? Ideas that ended up in the U.S. Constitution, for example. Debates about government power, individual rights, religious freedom. They echo these earlier struggles.
And the scientific method itself.
I mean, that insistence on evidence, observation, testing. It's not just for scientists. It's the basis of critical thinking. It drives technology, medicine. It underpins so much of how we try to understand the world accurately.
It shows how progress often comes from challenging the status quo, from dissent, from finding new ways to look at things.
Exactly. These periods show the consequences when new ideas meet resistance, but also how those clashes can push things forward.
So understanding where these ideas came from gives you perspective on today's debates, the tension between, say, freedom and order, or faith and reason.
These aren't new fights. They've been evolving for centuries, shaped by events like these. History isn't just dates. It's the story of the ideas we're still wrestling with.
Right. So the final thought for you, the listener, might be this. We live in our own time of rapid change, conflicting information, shifting authorities. How can reflecting on these past moments, these eras of profound intellectual change and reasoned dissent, help us navigate our own complex present, and maybe even help shape the turning points still to come?
That's a good question to ponder.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.